Today I'm going to be reading from my Western novel, Buck. And if you notice up here, there's a picture of some people that lived at about the same time as this story. These are my great-grandparents, and they came from Tennessee while Buck is in Colorado, but you can see the time period there. Chapter 1. Buck Sanders heaved the load of pelts from the back of his Appaloosa stallion and turned to the door of the southwestern Colorado trading post. Kicking it open with one boot, he walked in and slung the skins onto the counter. Then, without a word, he turned to get the rest of the skins from his pack mule. Though not above average height, Buck possessed the broad, powerful shoulders of a man who had done heavy work all of his life. That same work had made his stomach tight and his legs, though appearing somewhat scrawny in comparison to his chest, straight and strong. Those who had been in a position to find out knew those legs were extremely quick when the need arose. Reaching the mule, he ran his fingers through his wavy shoulder-length hair. The ends, sun-bleached blonde the previous summer, glistened in the afternoon light of this bright but chilly early March day in 1882. His sky-blue eyes squinted at the load on the mule's back. He scratched his red-tinted beard that he had carefully trimmed with his short knife that morning. There were some nice fox skins on the mule, enough for a coat. Some lady's husband on one coast or the other would pay a good price for such a coat. Why not some lady's husband here? As he thought this, the image of a slender woman entered his mind. It was not the image of a banker's or doctor's wife, but that of a woman he had seen down the street just a few minutes before. Her clothing had been simple, and her cloth coat somewhat faded. Though her copper-colored hair had been drawn back into a tight braided bun, the delicate ends which had escaped held promise of supple beauty when released. She could use a good fur coat, he thought, and would have set the skins off to better advantage than the foxes themselves. He set the fox pelts aside, wrapping them in an old tarp, and carried the rest of his winter's catch into the shop. All this time he was thinking about that woman he'd seen with the copper braids. It brought up a feeling he'd occasionally had before up in the mountains. This feeling was the hardest thing about the trapper's life: loneliness. He didn't notice it often in the mountains. He found himself to be a good companion, and nature always provided a topic of conversation, even if the only one he could talk to was God. However, coming to town each spring reminded him of how long and alone winter nights could be. He wasn't interested in the painted saloon women. He'd seen enough of them as he'd tagged around as a child with his drunken father in St. Louis. But even those women reminded him of his loneliness, and he sometimes wondered how an itinerant trapper could ever get to know a woman worth letting into his life. The owner of the shop was unknown to him, and Buck watched warily as the man examined his merchandise. If the man didn't offer a fair price, he would keep the skins and take them to Telluride or Silverton, maybe even as far as Denver, after he'd checked on the children. That was the only reason he had traveled west instead of east this spring with his winter's take. He had promised the woman he'd hired to watch his sister's orphaned children that he would be by in the spring to pay her. He'd left enough with her for winter supplies, but felt he couldn't trust her to stay and do right by the little ones if he paid her the whole amount promised. It was too bad the children's uncle on their father's side hadn't offered to care for the children. He had a wife who had been caring for the kids when their parents died. That would have been a whole lot simpler. Decent furs, said the shop owner hesitantly. The best, Buck replied. I don't start trapping until cold weather sets in and the animal's fur is at its prime. Ragged furs I scrape clean and use for my own needs. Buck fingered the leather short coat he had finished the week before. Pieced with various shades of light brown skins, it fell straight from the shoulders with an Indian-style fringe around his hips. The short coat had wide sleeves, and to the ends of the sleeves and around the neck he had painstakingly sewn dark borders of wolf fur from a young animal that he had found mangled by a bear. The buttons were short, hand-carved sticks that slipped through looped leather thongs. He'd bought a jacket like this made by an Indian woman some years ago and had copied it carefully. The leather was not as soft and supple as he'd like, but using oak leaves to get his tanning acid was a rather hit-and-miss process, and he'd been in a hurry to finish the coat before it was time to head down the mountain. The softest leather he'd ever felt had been chewed by Indian women, but he was not interested in spending his winter nights chewing hides. The trader gave the jacket an appraising glance. Nice work, he said. Then he named a decent price for the furs. Buck haggled a little over the price, as was expected. The man came up a little, not much. Then Buck took the money and turned to leave. The trader cleared his throat. Buck stopped and looked back at him. I noticed you kept some of your take. Do you ever sell finished goods? Might. Buck turned back to the door and walked out. He started to lead his horse and mule toward the stable he had passed coming into town, when saloon doors banged open and a young giant flew through them and rolled into the street. Buck stepped into the doorway of a chemist's shop to avoid the commotion. He was not afraid of involvement with the large young man. An old Chinaman in another trading town had taught him some tricks that made size unimportant in a fight. He just knew it was better to steer clear of trouble when you did not know the lay of the land. A painted lady came out after the man and knelt by him in the dirt. The giant sat up and with the help of the lady stood. Two more men, neither over 21, barged out of the saloon and stood there laughing at the one in the road. Buck heard the saloon girl say, "Come on, honey. I'll help you back to your place. You know there's no point in arguing with Zeb when he says you've had enough." A strong young man like that should be working, not drunk this time of day, murmured Buck under his breath. The other two went back inside, and Buck, giving a quick nod to the chemist through the glass door, pulled his beasts of burden back into the main thoroughfare. From between two buildings he saw a wheelbarrow appear, loaded with coal and buffalo chips. As it turned onto the road in front of him, Buck realized, with a strange lurch of his innards, that pushing the wheelbarrow was the woman with copper hair he had seen earlier. She struggled to maintain control of the heavy wheelbarrow as it caught on a rut in the dirt. Buck took 3 quick strides to her and caught the side of the cart with one hand. It righted, and the coal and chips, which had started to shift to one side, slid back towards the center. Buck looked up to see smiling blue eyes ringed by thick black lashes. He grinned shyly and tipped his hat. "Oh, thank you for your help," said a delightfully pink mouth with a short upper lip. Buck dragged his eyes back to hers. "'Twarn't nothing, miss." He frowned. This female looked to be little more than a child. Her slender figure and small hands added to the impression already left by a pert little nose and flushed cheeks. Then he looked back at her mouth. Though shaped almost like a child's, it closed firmly, and the set of her jaw showed maturity. Still, a small woman like this shouldn't be lugging around heavy loads of fuel. "Is there somewhere I can take this for you, lady?" he asked. She repositioned her small red hands on the handlebars. "Oh, no, I'm supposed to do this, sir." Buck bristled. "Who said so? Your husband?"